we're going to get started, and before we do, how many people live in Rhinebeck? Great, and how many people are here from Red Hook? Great, okay, so Northern Dutchess is the only part of Dutchess that I have in my district. So I am your assembly member. So the State Assembly is the lower chamber of the state government. There's 150 of us, so we are bigger in size compared to the State Senate. The State Senate is almost half, but that's the upper house. We are the lower house, and I represent District 103rd, which is the Mid-Hudson Valley area with 14 towns and cities. City of Kingston is the only city I have in my district, and if you count all of the local governments, we represent around 21 local governments, including the county ones. We do have a Democratic majority in the state, including in the Assembly. Around 103 are in the majority party, and the rest are in the minority party. So, I confirmed before, but everybody can hear me? Yeah. Okay, so we're going to go through a presentation, and then we're going to do Q&A. We have to be out here by 7:50, so we're going to keep it tight and get rolling. So we're going to start with the landscape of the energy sector. If you don't know why you're here, it's because we have introduced a bill to replace Central Hudson with a publicly owned utility. You might have noticed Central Hudson is also here today, so you will have the chance to ask questions and so on. All right. So first thing to note, this idea or the debate of who should own the energy sector, whether it should be public or private, is not new. I would love to take credit for having come up with this idea, but unfortunately it is as old as energy itself. People have been arguing about this since the beginning, and this is just one example. I was quizzing people here before which state has 0 investor-owned utilities. Does anybody want to take a guess?
Wyoming?
Nebraska. And that is one more indication that in the beginning it was quite actually a fight led by the Conservative Party, and the Liberal Party was opposed to it. And the reason there are so few investor-owned utilities, or 0, in Nebraska is because Senator Norris, who was a senator there, he was a Republican state representative, was a very strong supporter of public ownership of power. But here we have Tom Johnson, who is another historic figure in this fight. When he ran for to be Cleveland's mayor in 1901, he said, "I believe in the municipal ownership of these monopolies, because if you do not own them, they in turn will own you." And this was at a time when the model for public ownership was at the municipal level, and that has, that is still very common, but it has expanded beyond that scale since then. So Central Hudson is a delivery utility. When people see their bill, they see the supply charges, they see the delivery charges, and almost everyone is confused. But in New York, we have 7 investor-owned utilities. There's an exception on Long Island where it's a public-private partnership, but because there's an investor-owner, we're going to call it an investor-owned utility. If you are an investor-owned delivery utility, you are a corporate monopoly that is given a carved-out service area to serve in, and you are the only delivery company in that area. So we have 7 across the state. And if you are one of those utilities, you are not allowed to also build energy in New York State, because that side is deregulated and it happens through a wholesale market, so multiple companies can compete to develop energy, but not the case when it's delivery, and we're going to get into that a little bit. But just to explain the 3 components of the energy infrastructure, you have to build the energy somewhere. Then transmission is to bring that energy into the grid, right? You're going to connect it to the grid. And from the grid, you got to take that energy to the end users. So that's delivery. So that's Central Hudson's main business. They are not responsible really for the supply side of your bill, or even for controlling the supply prices. So why are these companies allowed to be monopolies? Because a lot of the time people will say, what can't we just make it competitive? Can't we just break up the monopoly? So in this case, the delivery infrastructure of energy is considered to be what's called a natural monopoly. And this is a sector where the fixed cost of operation is so high that if you split that work between different companies who are then gonna claim revenues from a smaller group of people, you're probably gonna see an increase in rates and not a decrease. So this is a specific type of industry where competition does not lower rates, right? So this is the consensus. And why is that? Because the energy delivery structure, infrastructure is very expensive to own and maintain. But if you also think about the logistics, like we are talking about the electricity poles, we are talking about the gas lines and so on. If you run multiple copies of those on the same street, it's not gonna make sense, right? It doesn't make sense at all. So our question is, if the sector is considered national monopoly, then why is it for profit? So who owns Central Hudson? Fortis is a Canadian holding company that owns 12 utilities or energy companies across the world. Central Hudson is one of them. And this is a very common model of ownership for utilities all over the world right now. This is not an exception by any means, unless they have public power. But Fortis owns Central Hudson, which is the only utility they own in New York, and then other similar companies own other utilities and so on. So how is Central Hudson funded? What does it mean to be an investor-owned utility? What it means is, in this case, 48% of Central Hudson's funding comes through equity, so those are shareholders. Those are shareholders making their investments. And then the 52% comes from issuing debt, which is a fairly common way for corporations of this size to raise money to do business. And then what you see here at the bottom are all of the things that the customers are responsible for paying for. So all of the bills that customers pay have to be high enough to cover operating costs, the capital investments, so that's the physical infrastructure, the financing costs, because when you borrow money, there's interest, there's other types of financing costs. As a for-profit company, you also pay federal and state taxes, which is a substantial amount. And then you also got to pay enough that the people who are investing their money get the profits that they are expecting to see. So when Central Hudson asks for a rate increase and they're talking about an increase in revenue requirements, that's what they're talking about. They need a certain amount of money to be able to cover all of those expenses. So what has the last two rate increases look like? So I got into office 2023, so that was when I intervened in the first rate case. So in that one, they requested an increase of revenue requirement of $181 million, and they were approved $79.3 million. Now this was a one-year rate case, which is actually not very common. So they filed, so that year is done, right? So they filed for another rate increase, and they said they needed $62.5 million more. This went into settlement negotiations between all of the parties involved in the rate case, including our office. And when that happens, what's common is instead of approving it for a year, it's a multi-year agreement. So what's been approved is $143.7 million over 3 years. And a pattern you can see is that, generally speaking, about 50% of what is requested tends to be approved, and that is true not just for Central Hudson, but as a trend for investor-owned utilities.
But that's the increase. What's the base of that?
Yeah, so we will get to the questions in a bit because there's a lot to cover. So
I'm sorry.
yes, so don't forget your question. And so we intervened in as a party in the rate case, and one of the things that they said before the PSC voted to approve those rates, because we really made a case on the profit margin, or it's called return on equity. And at that meeting, the state regulators said the rates must balance, quote, affordability concerns against utility shareholders' constitutional right to earn a reasonable return on investment. And this is just from a few days ago. So this is something I've known for a while, but I assume lots of people don't know, which is that when the state regulators say just and reasonable rates, we're not necessarily talking about just the customers, we're also talking about what is fair to investors. So how is this profit calculated? This is the formula that upends everything and that we see as a problem we cannot solve until we get rid of the investor owners altogether. So you have your capital investments. This is your capital assets. And you apply the equity ratio to calculate how much of that is shareholder investment. The total value of that capital investment, you apply the return on equity, and you get your authorized profits. So right now, Central Hudson's ROE, I believe, is around 9.5%. And during this intervention, we got information from Central Hudson where they basically said if they go below 9%, it's basically junk investment, right? Nobody's going to invest. So we said, okay, let's do it 9%. But of course, nobody thinks it should be 9%. People generally agree, as you see from the state regulators' quote, that there has to be productive returns for the investments for this business to stay afloat because of the way the financing world works, and we're gonna get into that in a little bit. But what is to know from this formula is the higher the total value of the capital investment, the more authorized profits you're gonna get. The other way to increase this is if you increase the return on equity. Now, if we think about a corporation like Walmart, the way they increase their profits is by slashing costs, right? And selling more goods. It is almost the invert of that in case of these energy delivery utilities, because if you decrease the value of your capital investment, you're also decreasing the authorized profits, and you might hear from Central Hudson saying often that the best way to pay lower bills is to conserve energy, right? So it's the almost flip of your common corporation model. So what this formula does is it creates an incentive to overinvest. So just to give you another quote from the Department of Public Service, which is body of the state regulator. They're talking about me. Contrary to Assemblymember's argument, because I said it should be 9% or lower, it would not be appropriate to consider any comparison of publicly owned utilities in setting the returns of investor-owned utilities, because publicly owned utilities do not share the same risks of operations. Thank you very much, I agree. And they have access to funding that is unavailable to investor-owned utilities. Also agree. This is what we're really here to talk about. So what is the perverse incentive? And this is an industry-wide trend, so it's not like one utility is the bad guy and they're the only ones who are being greedy. It's not like that. It's an industry-wide phenomenon where when your profits are calculated that way, there is an incentive to overinvest in unnecessarily capital-intensive methods. And that's the methods that utilities tend to choose to provide service, and that is what makes the authorized profits higher. And there's lots of reports on this phenomenon. But just to summarize what that looks like, this is a fairly new report that came out in January of this year. And if you picked up our rectangular newsletter, there's a full link to the PDF if you want to get technical and read it. But just to explain how they say it, they call it financial alchemy, because every dollar of shareholder capital they invest turns into roughly $2 in their stock market value, a powerful incentive to invest as much as possible. Now, they're not talking about Central Hudson, they're talking about any investor-owned utility. So our bill is basically to replace Central Hudson with a state-owned public benefit not-for-profit corporation, which we are calling the Hudson Valley Power Authority, and our bill is the Hudson Valley Power Authority Act. So one thing that I will say right away is that when you create an authority through legislation, you can do a bad job or you can do a good job. Okay, if you do a bad job, you can create a bad authority. So it's not like this model is inherently good. It depends on how you design it, on how you write the legislation. So just to give you the top level idea of how we have designed it, what Hudson Valley Power Authority is, and what it is not, okay? So first, it is a financially independent, state-owned, not-for-profit corporation. These already exist. So that means what it's not a taxpayer-funded state agency that depends on the state budget. So, you know, we are usually more familiar with the state agencies like Department of Labor or whatever. Those entities are funded through taxpayers, through the state budget. That is not the case for state-owned corporate authorities. Okay, so that's just one distinction. The second is, we are not, no thank you, right? A slow-moving, bureaucratic agency run by politicians and people who don't know what they're doing. We don't want that. We don't care if that's public or private, we don't want that. What we have designed is a cutting-edge utility that's going to embrace new technologies and experts. And in fact, the reason we want public ownership is not because public ownership is the end, but because it is the means to get the grid to what it needs to be without breaking the backs of the customers. So third, we want this to be a thriving, revenue-funded utility. So this is sort of linked to this. When you are working through a state budget, you run into a few issues. One of them is sometimes we pass a lot of laws, but we don't actually fund how to do that work. So that is not the case in this state corporation. It's fully funded through revenues, and we don't want it to be the kind of corporation that is operating in an austerity mindset. We are really going for quality as the priority. Finally, we have lots of provisions in the bill to make it accountable to the public with ongoing community oversight, because again, what we don't want, an opaque agency where nobody really knows what's happening, and sometimes with the state budget we fund money, and even legislators don't know what happened with it, if it did the thing that we wanted it to do. We do not like that, right? So we have lots of provisions in the bill that we're going to get into. That's about accountability to the public and transparency and so on. The next big thing when it becomes a publicly owned utility is then you're no longer barred from being relegated to doing just delivery, because that only really applies to investor-owned utilities. So as a trend, publicly owned utilities are what's called vertically integrated, and that means you can do all three things. So that comes with some advantages as well. So in terms of goals and outcomes, what are the outcomes we are looking for through public ownership, right? The first is low rates. Now, I just want you to note a few things. We did not say free. We did not say frozen. We are saying lower, right? We're not promising something that we can't actually do. So why public ownership for lower rates? And again, this is capturing a picture from something that is happening recently. This is from the same report. Over the last 3 years, residential electricity rates for privately owned utilities have increased by 49% more than inflation, whereas those for publicly owned utilities have increased by 44% less than inflation. So whether you're public or private, there are certain things that are not in your control. Interest rates, the economy you're operating on, wage needs, right? Infrastructure needs. But what we are trying to do is get the cost of running this thing to be as low as possible. That's why we are saying lower rates. So how do we get to those lower rates? So first, as you know, we eliminate profits. That's like the most basic thing. But what is even more important to know, and this is really the core that you're gonna have to grasp in your mind, is eliminating that perverse incentive that we talked about. So the perverse incentive is a mechanism to keep increasing the value of the capital assets and therefore the authorized profits. If you don't have investor owners, you don't have that incentive. There's no incentive left to overinvest in capital intensive things. You're gonna do it just by need, right? So not subject to federal or state taxes. As a trend, publicly owned utilities do pay property taxes, and this is the case here as well, because property taxes go to municipalities who need to spend it on Medicaid and school district and so on. So that is always preserved, but what is exempted, again, as an industry-wide pattern, are subject and that is not subject to federal or state taxes. And you know, it's not Central Hudson that pays these taxes, it's us, right? Because we pay for everything. The fourth is access to lower cost financing, including lower interest rates. As a state-owned corporation, you don't have the same limitations and credibility issues that for-profit companies have. You know, the quote from before where they said, well, you know, publicly owned utilities just don't face a similar kind of risk. So this is like part of what they're talking about. And I mentioned it would be authorized to generate energy, so there's a potential for more revenues, because if they build this energy, they can sell this to the wholesale market and collect more revenues that way. So that's not coming out of your pockets, right? And then, as a publicly owned authority, and as a trend, you can also access the New York Power Authority's cheap and clean local energy. Now, New York Power Authority, we will get into that in a little bit, is the country's largest publicly owned energy provider, created through the New York State Legislature under FDR when he was the governor. And they own some of the cheapest energy really in the country, even through New York's publicly owned hydropower. And that is a highly coveted energy that is limited in amount, but NYPA does have priority customers, so they provide directly to municipal-owned utilities and public buildings and so on. So our bill wants us to be on that list because, of course, why not? And finally, when you eliminate perverse incentives, the only incentive that's left is to invest in efficiencies, and efficiencies don't make any money for investor owners, right? So those two things are very interconnected. And we're going to get into some examples as well. So New York Power Authority was signed into law in 1931. And the reason FDR wanted to create this authority to own and manage New York's hydropower is because the people who wanted to buy it were people like JP Morgan and all these Wall Street investors. So at the time, FDR said these people should absolutely not own our hydropower, and when that energy came online, it immediately lowered rates for all the customers. So today, NYPA manages and owns the state's hydropower, which is some of the cheapest electricity in North America. They also own and operate a significant portion of the state's transmission lines. About a third of the state's high voltage transmission lines is owned and operated by NYPA. And similar to what I described in the what it is and what it is not, NYPA is a state corporation. They are not a state agency funded by the state budget. In fact, they have been so financially lucrative that sometimes they lend money to the state temporarily and then the state pays them back. So we have also newly authorized NYPA to build our own publicly owned renewable energy and to use that to lower costs, because right now if you look at the wholesale market for supply, there's not a lot of cheap energy, especially renewable, right? And with the federal tariffs and so on, the fossil fuel source is also going to feel a squeeze. So NYPA can inject into this wholesale market publicly built renewable energy and use that money to fund automatic discounts for the neediest households. Now, why did we pass this bill? We passed this in 2023, and in fact, that was the bill I ran to pass, and then it became, once I won, it became a more ambitious project than I thought, but the reason we passed it is because until then, NYPA was not allowed to build new energy because the private companies thought that it would be so good at it that it would be unfair to them. They said so, I'm paraphrasing, but they said so, it just wouldn't be fair to compete with them because they have so many advantages. So, and to quickly add, they have announced their initial plan of how much they're going to build, and it's going to be around 7 gigawatts in the first round. So, this is just to give you an example of what kind of gap can exist in the financial viability of a publicly owned corporation and a privately owned. Now, I'm not saying you can swap this out for Hudson Valley Power Authority, right? I'm not saying that because that authority doesn't exist yet. What I'm saying is that just because the corporation is state-owned doesn't mean it's down the gutter, right? Because that's what people think. People hear the word public sector, people hear the word government, and they think it's going to be the worst possible version of whatever exists. But this is just to give you an example. NYPA has one of the highest bond ratings. We actually think they could take a little bit more risk because it doesn't really need to be that high. And if you compare long-term debt that was issued in 2022 to NYPA, the interest rate they paid for that is around 3.62%, 62%. And if you compare that to Central Hudson, it's almost double. And who pays the interest rates? Yes, we, right? Everything. We pay for everything. So when you're a corporation that is owned by the state, you are considered a much more reliable investment. So that's where the financing cost makes a difference. So how can the savings grow? Now I know that in the pamphlets that you received from Central Hudson, one of their claims is, well, nobody knows lower rates. What is that, right? Nobody knows. Central Hudson also doesn't know what its rate is going to be past these 3 years. What has been approved is for 3 years. After that, who knows? Nobody knows. So this is just a demonstrative example. Let's say, okay, actually I skipped one. Let's say we buy Central Hudson, right? And if we hadn't bought it, Central Hudson's rate increases by 6% every year. Again, this is just an illustrated example. Let's say if we buy Central Hudson out, the rate drops a little and it stays flat. I'm going to be the first one to say this is probably not a realistic scenario, but just to give you a visual to what projected savings could look like. So this cone, that's the savings, right? Usually people think, when we're talking about savings, usually people think it's just this dot. How much do you save at the point of acquisition? And that is not what we're talking about. We're talking about protecting customers from what we think is going to be ever increasing rates, and we have a reason to believe it, which we'll get to in the next few slides. And let's say, another example, let's say Central Hudson increases by 6% every year, and Hudson Valley Power Authority increases by 2% every year. So you can start to imagine different combinations depending on what's happened to the economy, what that savings, the cone of savings, could look like. So again, this is just for visual purposes and not made based on real data, but it is the visual representation of that quote from earlier, that said, the sort of the difference between how much on average rates have increased for publicly owned versus privately owned. So the first goal, of course, lower rates. The second equally important goal is we want a 21st century grid. Now, what does that mean? If you look at Central Hudson's rate case filing, you'll see that in the more recent ones, a big chunk of it was to replace aging infrastructure, right? That is not anything out of the ordinary. This infrastructure gets old, it was built a long time ago, and when it ages, it needs to be replaced. However, we this replacement should happen at the lowest cost possible and with no attachment to the authorized profits. Because right now, everything that is involved in replacing aging infrastructure is a capital investment. So not only are we paying the price for the work, we are also most likely paying a higher financing cost for that, a higher interest rate, and also higher costs because of the authorized profit that is charged on every dollar. So there was a report from the PSC a couple of years ago looking into the feasibility of burying power lines. And their recommendation was that it would be so expensive, it's not worth the benefits, right? So that's an example of the type of capital work that is already so expensive that when you put this into this formula of financialization, it becomes prohibitively expensive. It's not even worth it anymore, right? So to me, that is not a good situation for a national monopoly with so much capital infrastructure. Another example of high cost is replacing leak-prone gas pipes, right? Of course, you have to replace this. It's very old pipes. They need to be, brought into a good shape, but it is very expensive. And again, when you throw it into this financialization model, it is unnecessarily expensive. So because of that, we also see an effect on resiliency. So for example, here I say reduce the cost of capital improvements, for example, strengthening transmission lines. Central Hudson is spending money on strengthening transmission lines. We just think it could be done at a cheaper rate. Similar for the prospects of burying power lines wherever it's possible. This is very common in European countries. We understand that it's not possible everywhere. It's not suitable for every area. But whatever can be buried has not been buried because of cost issues. The other thing is regular maintenance, like tree trimming, does not make profits, right? That is more like an operational cost because Central Hudson doesn't own the tree, so it's not part of their capital infrastructure. We think that we could invest more money than we do now in terms of workforce and so on to do tree trimmings and inspecting gas lines maybe as like a regular part of the work that is not happening right now. Every day, I live in Ulster Park, which is like a fairly rural area, and I always see trees that are like resting, resting on the power lines. But it's cheaper to just let that tree fall and fix it afterward than to go and say, hey neighbor, I'm gonna take your tree out. I'm your power authority, right? We think it should be the opposite. And efficiencies we kind of covered. I mentioned here is an example, dynamic line rating. So because this is like some of the technical thing that is like hard to mention, okay, but what do you mean when you're talking about efficiencies? So for example, I have a bill that says the PSC should, the Public Service Commission, should get utilities to adopt dynamic line ratings more. And what that means is a technology where through the same power line, you can have a dynamic threshold for how much power you can flow through it. Right now, most of these power lines tend to be static, and they're capped for a certain temperature beyond which they're gonna sag and be unsafe and so on. But there are technologies out there where through the same power line you could jiggle how much power can go through it using this technology, right? So that's just one example. And again, European countries use it a lot. The fourth thing is Central Hudson's grid is our only grid. We don't have another option. So when we build a new energy project and it is too expensive to connect, there's not like an alternative grid we can connect to. We have to connect to Central Hudson. But right now, there are these costs called interconnection costs that are too high for new clean energy projects to go online. And Ulster County, most of this is in Ulster County. They have 2 brownfields that they wanted to convert to solar sites. But they have had to abandon that project because the interconnection is too expensive. Now, if you're a publicly owned corporation, you don't have quarterly earnings to show. You can say, you know what, we're gonna make an upfront investment in interconnection, and maybe we will even co-own the brownfields with Ulster County, and we will recoup the cost of this over like the next 30 years so that people don't feel it, and then people will feel the benefits of it in real time as well, so that it's sort of like, nets it out. A publicly owned corporation can take upfront risks, and that's one of the reasons we passed that bill for NIPA as well, because even on the development side, a lot of private developers drop out when their profit projection is just not there. They need profit projections to survive. That's their business model. Publicly owned companies do not, right? They can take upfront risks. The last thing is, as a state authority, you can have a role to coordinate better with other state entities that exist in the state. For example, NYSERDA, NYSO that manages the wholesale market supply, ORIS, which is the permitting entity, and so on. As an investor-owned utility, you're not really in those conversations, but as a state authority, you're much better positioned to be in that conversation. So democracy and transparency. We think creating a publicly owned corporation is not that useful if they're not accountable, democratic, and transparent. And not only in this case, but I have other bills, even for NIPA, where I have introduced legislation, because NIPA was created a long time ago. I have introduced legislation even to make NIPA itself more democratic, because I think that if we're going to give state authorities so much power, the very least we deserve in return is to know what they're doing, right? To have an accountability measure. So, first thing first, right now, Central Hudson is owned by Fortis, and they have their own private board. We obviously don't have a say on who gets on that board. Then they have the management, then they have the workers. So we are not changing the management or the workers, we are changing the governing bodies. So instead of Fortis, it's going to be owned by the state as an independent corporation. We replace the private board with a more democratic board of trustees that I'm going to show you in a bit. And we replace the state regulation by the Public Service Commission with a civil society organization called the Observatory, which is a community oversight body that directly works with the board to hold this entity accountable. Right now, Public Service Commission's main job is to regulate investor-owned utilities all over the state. They're not concerned with just one utility, right? It's for the whole state. And the only time they step in is when something is already happening, right? Central Hudson asks for a rate case, then the PSC is involved, right? So this is a slightly different model where the coordination between the civil society and the board is all year round. It's just a matter of the operation. However, we do think there is a smaller role for Public Service Commission, which is that it has a holistic view of what utilities are doing towards climate goals, and we think it makes sense for them to have some jurisdiction over the climate goals and a different type of accountability. So what are some of the provisions in the bill to make the Hudson Valley Power Authority accountable? I mentioned this year-round community oversight instead of through the PSC. The second is we require the board to hold regular public meetings to discuss business, including rates and resource plans. Right now, the only time you can provide your input to Central Hudson is when there are hearings, when rate cases have already been announced, right? When things are already not in your control. And many people, increasingly don't even see the point of going to the hearings. You take time off your work, you wait to speak, and then nothing even, people feel like it doesn't even make an impact. So here, the board is required to hold regular public meetings. And special meetings can also be called by the Observatory, which is the oversight body, or if 10% of the customers get together and sign a petition, let's say maybe you say, oh, there's this site in Rhinebeck, we would like this to, interconnect your grid. Can we have a special meeting? And you've got 10% of the customer signature from this area, you could call a special meeting. Board is also required to hold semi-annual public assemblies, so these are bigger events to encourage public participation. And you'll see this more in the co-op model. The co-op model is different from the public authority model, but especially in the case of co-ops, that co-op is only as good as the public participation rate. There are bad co-ops because none of the members are participating and it becomes this closed circle. But we really think that one of the benefits of having a public corporation is that there's room for public participation instead of these investor owners, right? We have quite a few extensive public reporting requirements, and we really want to make sure that some of these mandates are written into the statute and not left to the discretion of the board. So we don't want these kind, good-hearted people to get appointed in the board and hope they make the best decisions, right? We want anybody who gets on the board has certain mandates that they are required to deliver for the utility. At the same time, we also want to balance with not over-prescribing granular day-to-day things for the company, but create the framework for how this should operate. And no responsibility towards external parent company or shareholders. If you remove Fortis, if you remove shareholders, there's only one group left to be responsible towards, and that's the customers and, of course, the workers. So, we're gonna, I'm sure there will be some comments in the Q&A section, but we disagree with Central Hudson on our bill being bad for workers. This is a big point of disagreement. We think 400 union workers for Central Hudson out of over 1,000 or whatever is too small of a union. We think that unions should grow. We think that when short-term contractors need to be hired, it's understandable when they need to be hired, but we do think the union should have a say. We also think it's not enough to give HBPA the authority to generate energy. We have put in gold labor standard that was the first to pass in the nation when we passed the NIPA bill. We have copy-pasted all of that language we co-wrote with CIO and applied it to HBPA as well. Fine, you want to build energy? Great. Here are the labor standards we want you to follow, because the renewable sector is not great for workers or unions. So we also want to make sure that this bigger energy transition that's happening everywhere, so this is one transition, right? Our bill is one specific transition, but there's a bigger transition happening everywhere, and there are for-profit companies also trying to stake their claim in this energy transition. And these for-profit companies really deprioritize worker protections on the development side. So we want to make sure that we preserve Central Hudson workers' private sector legally, because that means they preserve their right to strike, their contract terms, their pensions, their retirement plans, and so on. And we borrowed this from a report that came out of a task force on Long Island. Because in New York, if you're public sector workers, you don't have the right to strike, and then you would change your contract terms and so on. So we don't want the workers to have to deal with that. We also mandate Hudson Valley Power Authority to, when they're hiring new people, to prioritize the hiring of local workers as well as those that are affected by the energy transition. For example, the workers who work on gas lines, their skills are very transferable to geothermal. And we're going to be needing a lot more geothermal because solar and wind is not going to be enough. And in that case, we really want the workers who are already in the sector to be prioritized for hiring. We also give the union 1 seat in the Board of Trustees and 2 seats in the governing body of the Oversight Observatory, which makes them the only stakeholder that has a role in both those sides, the operation as well as the oversight, because we want the worker conversation also to be part of the ongoing conversation and not just happening around rate cases and so on. I said earlier, we do not want Hudson Valley Power Authority to be an austere corporation. We want it to be a thriving corporation. That does mean making sure that worker needs are being met and they are not being compromised just to lower rates, right? Because the workers are also customers, they also live in the Central Hudson territory. The affordability needs might be higher. You know, there might be needs for childcare or so on. So we do want Hudson Valley Power Authority to be a good employer, especially as a company that is rooted in a community and is never going to leave. We think it's very important to be a good employer. Right now, everything workers need have to go through a hugely politicized rate case. So if they need new vans, it has to be approved in the rate case. And now we have a situation where some customers are so upset with their high bills. Some people do come and say, you've given the union too much power. You know, some people do come and say you just need to prioritize the lower rates, and we basically don't agree with that. I think we need a holistic quality expectation for this utility, because when the perverse incentives are gone, when the financing costs are lower, when the shareholders are gone, there will be enough to maintain a certain level of integrity. Finally, right now, when Central Hudson contracts with other third parties to build things, for example, in the town of Ulster, they built a huge training facility. They are not required to follow any labor standards. We think that at the very least, we should require prevailing wage when the utility is contracting with third parties. So, yes, that was all. So what does the transition actually look like? I'm just going to give you the top level bird's eye view of what needs to happen. So first, our bill needs to pass, because that piece of legislation is what's creating the state authorization to do all these things. So people will ask, well, what if Fortis doesn't want to sell, right? What if Central Hudson doesn't want to sell? So that's all covered in the state authorization, and that's how it works. So the same bill has to pass in the Senate and the Assembly. It needs to be signed by the governor before it can be enacted. And what is written in the text is basically creating this new authority, giving it the certain powers, responsibilities, and requirements that we need it of, and having that written into state law. So that's how that works. So step one, we need to create the corporation. Step two, I'm going to show you the boards where we will need to appoint members. Step three, there's going to be lawsuits and negotiations. This is a pretty fairly common part of the process, because this is where Fortis has the last chance to kill this project, right? However, the law is on our side. These type of authorizations have happened before, so we expect to win. When you're talking about smaller municipal takeover campaigns, one way they try to kill it is by making them run out of money on legal fees and so on. That's another reason we've gone with the state authority model, because they're much more powerful. And then, once we cross that hurdle, we're going to issue bonds to raise revenue. So these are revenue corporate bonds that are going to be paid back by the bills people pay. Then we acquire Central Hudson. At this point, we expect the parent company to usually negotiate a price, because if they don't negotiate, they might be stuck with a deal that's worse for them. And then we hand it off for the day-to-day operations. Now, there are some safety guards in the bill. For example, before any of this happens, the PSC does need to review it to confirm that the rates will be lower, right? They have to authorize the acquisition. So if the PSC sees data and they're like, there's no way this is going to decrease rates, this is not moving forward, right? If there's any evidence that it's going to increase rates, this is not moving forward, okay? The other thing is, another safeguard is when these kind of transitions happen, the existing for-profit corporation is held responsible for being collaborative on a seamless transition, and this has happened in the past, so that there is no disruption. That comes with part of the agreement, the negotiations, right? Everybody agrees to certain things, and that's one of them that we require in the bill. So how much would it cost? We have had different people attempt different analysis, and we expect that there would be more thorough analysis before this bill has any chance of moving in Albany. If you remember the cone of savings, the main point I want to make is that even if we buy Central Hudson at break even, what we're going for is the savings in the day-to-day operations, right? So even if we bought Central Hudson at a loss, we're still looking for those day-to-day savings. So that's the kind of thing the PSC will have to analyze before authorizing the acquisition. But just to remember that it's not about the point of acquisition, it's about whether, as an operation, it's going to lower rates. So Board of Trustees, right now, state authorities have similar boards, but what's common is that almost all of the appointees are usually picked by the governor, and then the Senate has to confirm the appointees. This is also the case for the Public Service Commission. We find that the governor having all of the appointments is not very democratic, generally speaking. So and this is an understanding in Albany. A way to make appointments more democratic is to give the legislative appointments majority over the governor's appointments, because that is going to be appointments made by state legislators who actually represent the Central Hudson area, which means that we will be conferring with local stakeholders to see who should be on this board, right? And this already happens for some boards, like, people from the same region will come together and we will say, okay, we have heard from all these people from our district who want to be appointed. Let's consult who is qualified, who is best suited, and so on. So in practice, what does that look like? The state senator that represents most of Central Hudson territory is Senator Michelle Hinchy, and then I represent the biggest area on the Assembly side. So we are going to start hearing from people who want to be on the board, and we could do things like hold forums, or send out the resume to people like the people who know this industry to see who we should put forward, and so on. So that's definitely more democratic than whoever the governor wants to appoint. Then we have the union, the business rep of the union on the Board of Trustees. We have the chair of the oversight body, and then we have an appointee from the oversight body. So this is how the civil organization is in constant communication in the decision-making process as well. And this is that body, right? The oversight body. The observatory is a model that comes out of Paris Water Authority, and it's also something that the Long Island campaign. In Long Island, there's a campaign to make their utility fully public instead of a half public, half private. So they've done a lot of already useful research and reports. And so they are also considering an observatory model, because that's proven to be the most modern way of doing oversight. So we have 11 legislative appointments across expertise. So legislative appointments mean between Senate and the Assembly. And if you cannot read the expertise areas, they're environmental justice, consumer protection, indigenous nation rights, community renewable energy, electrification, local government, and energy efficiency. So there will be somebody on this body representing the needs and interests of local governments as well. That includes school districts and so on. Then we have 2 legislative appointments from academic partners. So we have academic institutions in the Central Hudson territory that are already doing a lot of work on the energy sector, financing models and so on. In our case, we have a lot of interest from Bard College to be one of the academic partners, specifically one program in that college. And we also have some interest from SUNY New Paltz, because they also have a very active climate task force, and these could be ways to incorporate the knowledge, generally the knowledge of the energy sector, also into curriculum, and make it so that the overall brain power in this body is very fresh. And then on the same observatory board, we also get 2 representatives from the Central Hudson Union, which at this point will be the SGPA union. Lastly, examples. Everybody wants to know, well, who has done it before, right? So I would say right away, there are many successful publicly owned utilities, but we are trying to one-up them. We are trying to create the kind of model utility that we think should be everywhere. There is a book, if you're a book lover, there's a book called Democracy in Power. It's fairly new. And it's a history of electrification in the United States. That book ends with the third restructuring of the energy sector, by which the author is talking about public ownership. And this author happens to think the place in the United States of America where there are most exciting public power projects happening is New York. So when we passed that NYPA bill, when I ran for office, a lot of people would say, I love this idea, but it's never gonna happen, good luck, right? We did it, and we were the first in the nation to do it, and we were the first in the nation to pass gold labor standard for the renewable sector, and now we are about to build publicly owned energy, and I have already heard, I just emailed 2 state legislators in different states who want to talk to me because they want to do the same thing in their states, right? So we don't have to be content with just copying what exists. We're also trying to be a leader, right? We're trying to create the perfect utility that we think is going to have this 21st century grid. That said, let's get into some existing examples. So in Arizona, they have a utility that is the second largest in the country that is publicly owned, Salt River Project. They have a track record of being ranked first in residential customer satisfaction among all large electric utilities in the western US. So when somebody says, this all sounds great, but what if it sucks? It doesn't have to suck. We already have utilities that don't suck, right? They already exist. Second, they sold 2.3% of more total electricity to retail customers in 2022 compared to their private competitor, and they collected 21% less revenue than their private competitor. So these are more examples of how there's enough evidence in existence right now that just shows that these things are possible through public ownership, that we are not just trying to create magic out of thin air, that this is very much rooted in things that already exist. City of Austin. They created a city-owned utility in 1895. And this was around the time where I said there was a trend of municipal ownership.
Wow.
This utility serves electricity to the city and surrounding areas, and it returns its profits to the city's general fund to finance other city services. So this is one model. This is not, we're not going to fund the state budget, but just goes to show that successful publicly owned utilities already exist, and they are not failures, and they have not failed on their promises. Ironic, because Central Hudson is owned by Fortis, which is a Canadian holding company, but in Canada, at the turn of the century, they had a parallel fight for public ownership, as we did in the United States across the border. Their fight went in the direction of government-owned utilities, and that is still the case. Most of them are government-owned utilities that both generate and distribute electricity. And the other irony is, when we are talking about importing hydro from Canada, which I don't even support, by the way, because I think we should build our own. When we're talking about importing hydropower from Canada, we are importing from a publicly owned company in Canada. Okay, and I'm like, we don't have to. We can do this with NYPA right here. So these are just some examples. Now, we have not really focused right now on we're not trying to pass this bill this year or next year, right? What we're focused on right now is building the support that is needed to make it a reality in Albany. So I don't really believe when you're trying to do these big things that there is a shortcut. I think you have to do all the steps correctly. Yes, grassroots and building the support. There's no way to skip this. I don't want to go straight to mayors and town supervisors and say, I don't know what your constituents think, but you should support it. I don't want that, right? I want their support to be a reflection of the people they represent. So that means the people we're trying to get support out of right now are just regular customers, not people who are elected, not people who are already in a position of power. So we do need a lot of volunteers. So if you want to sign up, the first thing that happens if somebody says, yes, I want to volunteer, is you will be invited to a small group training. Usually we try to do 5 to 6 people. Some of them are led by myself. We train people on how to actually talk about this bill and how to talk about it factually, right? Because sometimes people may be so excited, if we don't train them, they might go out and say, your bills are going to be free, right? We don't want that kind of information going out. So lots of people are starting to volunteer. There's a coalition that is running like tabling and things like that. So this is one thing. The other is there is a petition that you can sign. There's also a paper version, but if you sign the online one, then somebody doesn't have to transcribe it. But we are trying to collect actual proof of how many people support it, because we don't want to make that claim without evidence, right? And then if we go to a place and we ask the mayor to support it, we want to be able to tell them, this is how many people in your city have signed this petition. So this, if you're not able to volunteer, this is something that you can share widely when you invite people to your dinner parties. Print out a petition, right? Tell them about this bill. But the fights that have been won have been huge grassroots efforts where literally everybody got involved, even like in the Canada fight when they went public. Even at that time, thousands of people convened in certain cities to go door knocking because they were going to vote on a franchise or something. Who should the franchise go to? So even back then, it was won with grassroots power. It was not won with just a few talking heads making a few decisions. So with that, Central Hudson is impacted by the recent payroll tax increase in the state, as well as Northern Dutchess. Northern Dutchess is actually Central Hudson is technically not in my district because it's headquartered in Poughkeepsie. But between Assemblymember Jonathan Jacobs and I, we did raise the point, like Central Hudson, we don't want Central Hudson to pay more in payroll mobility tax because that means the ratepayers will be paying more, right? We actually think, maybe utilities should be exempt from increases in payroll taxes. We also think payroll mobility tax is a regressive tax, okay? Because, and I'm getting to the tax side again, but when you put a tax on the size of your employees, the company then has an incentive to downsize the employees. And especially Northern Dutchess, it's a hospital. I know, hospitals also make money, they have their own problems, etc. But it's not a good way for the state to generate wealth. So my competing bill, and actually the Assembly supported initially our version, which was the increased corporate tax on the large profits, that would have also given us more money. Now MTA, many different points to tackle. One, as a trend, transit authorities are subsidized by taxpayers. That is not true for utilities. Why? When somebody is paying their utility bill, they're paying a pretty decent amount, even if it's publicly owned. When you're talking about MTA, you're talking about $1 here, you're talking about $3, $2. The only way to keep your massive public transit cheap is to subsidize with taxpayer money, which is why that's the norm in that industry, not the case with energy utilities. The other thing is, I mentioned earlier, for legal fees, the state will loan Hudson Valley Power Authority money that it will pay back, right? However, this bill does not need money from taxpayers. That is not what it's designed for. And this is just following the norm of how these acquisitions have happened for energy utilities before. Like even, wait, there was one more. You had so many, sorry, you had.
That's okay.
In the realm of MTA, MTA, yes. So this is why I co-sponsor 7 bills to fix the MTA. Because this is where we're talking about the accountability, transparency. Like I said, we don't want HVPA to just be publicly owned. We want it to be publicly owned with certain responsibilities, right? MTA is not an accountable democratic entity at all. So the way they were designed in law is not good enough, which is why I sponsor 7 bills. It's called Fix the MTA. to change that. So, you know, I am also very much invested in statewide public transit. And I think in Ulster County, we have the example of UCAT, which is a free bus that's countywide. We would love for UCAT to connect with Northern Dutchess at least. You know, I think it already connects with Poughkeepsie. So as somebody who's invested also in the need for affordable public transit, I'm very invested in MTA fixing themselves. They are not a good example. At the same time, the quality of life impact they have on New York City's working class is enormous. That doesn't mean the leadership is, you know, is where we need them to be. Yeah. Did I answer all your questions?
I think so. I don't know.